At 6 in the morning on March 3, 1943, a tropical breeze swept the Bismarck Sea near New Guinea. The waters of the vast Bismarck Sea remained as calm and flat as a mirror, reflecting the early morning sky above it. A Japanese rear admiral stood on the bridge of his flagship, his gaze sweeping across waters his navy claimed as their own. Within his sight, a massive convoy of 8 transports and 8 destroyers cut through the waves in a perfect formation. This fleet carried a critical payload, including 6,900 battle-hardened soldiers of the 50-1st Division. Their destination was L.A., New Guinea, to reinforce General Adaki, whose forces were locked in a grueling stalemate. At this moment, the admiral had every reason to believe that his large convoy would arrive safely at its final location. His confidence was rooted in the undisputed dominance that the Japanese Navy held in these waters over the past year. In all their previous runs, they had never faced a substantial challenge from any of the American surface fleets. Even the threat from the sky had become something of a routine nuisance for the veteran Japanese destroyer captains. Experiences taught captains that heavy B-17 flying fortresses, dropping bombs from 30,000 feet, rarely hit. Medium-altitude bombing gave agile warships plenty of time to spot the falling bombs and execute evasive maneuvers. As for low-flying torpedo bombers, they were practically target practice for the concentrated Japanese naval gunners. Japanese doctrine had a set of countermeasures, including dense anti-aircraft umbrellas and deadly Zero fighters nearby. It was this confidence that led Admiral Mikawa to authorize the mission even after American planes spotted them. What Kimura did not know was that in a hangar near Brisbane, rogue mechanics had spent months transforming a bomber. In 4 hours, these steel beasts would tear the escort fleet to shreds and turn it into burning wreckage on the sea. Sinking to the bottom of the sea alongside those warships would be the invincible aura of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This is the story of a weapon that completely destroyed the ability of Japan to maintain its vast island empire. An extra 8 machine guns of a bomber acted like a flying chainsaw that sawed many ships apart. To understand this massacre, we must go to Brisbane and meet an eccentric officer named Major Paul Irving Gunn. In 1942, this 42-year-old former Navy pilot was brewing up a completely insane master plan. At Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Major Gunn teamed up with Jack Fox from North American Aviation. Together, they locked their sights on the B-25 Mitchell, which was a standard medium bomber at the time. The B-25 was a good bomber, but dropping bombs from 7,000 feet yielded a dismal hit rate. A warship cruising at 15 knots only needed to make a slight course correction to dodge a falling bomb. Conversely, if you sent torpedo planes in low, they would be easily intercepted and shredded by Japanese Eros. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, desperately needed a new way to strike surface vessels. Concurrently, Major William Ben of the 43rd Bomb Group was pioneering a radical tactic called skip bombing. Flying B-17 bombers at 200 feet, Ben discovered that a bomb would skip like a stone on a pond. This ingenious tactic effectively turned the ocean surface into an extension of the bomb's overall trajectory. The skipping ordnance would slam into the waterline armor, penetrate the hull, and detonate deep inside the ship. Compared to traditional high-altitude bombing, skip bombing was an absolute revolution in terms of accuracy. Practicing on a shipwreck near Port Moresby, pilots drilled until they could plant a bomb within mere feet. But skip bombing had a fatal Achilles. It required the bomber to fly straight into enemy fire. Without a way to suppress the enemy gunners before releasing the bomb, it was effectively a suicide mission. This was the ultimate puzzle that Pappy, Gunn and Jack Fox set out to solve with their radical modification. Their answer was to ruthlessly cram 850 caliber Browning machine guns right into the glass nose. These thick black gun barrels jutted out like the fangs of a mechanical demon, radiating an aura of death. Let's break down the sheer terror of this flying meat grinder with some raw data on its firepower. Every single one of those Browning M2 machine guns was capable of unleashing 850 rounds per minute. When all 8 guns fired at once, this B-25 could spew a staggering 6,800 rounds. These weren't just standard bullets. They were M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds designed for maximum damage. Each projectile tore through the air at a blistering supersonic velocity of 2,910 feet. They could slice through a destroyer's thin deck armor like a hot knife, igniting raging infernos inside. Imagine the sheer horror of that scenario from the deck of a targeted vessel as the bomber approached. When a modified B-25 opened fire, hundreds of rounds would rain down like a monsoon of molten metal. The net of fire was enough to sweep the enemy warship's deck and neutralize any crew member exposed to the sky. Following this storm of lead, lethal skip bombs would slam into the waterline and trigger massive explosions. By March of 1943, the U.S. 3rd Attack Group had transitioned to this 8-gun nose setup. Under Major Edward Larner, the 90th Bomb Squadron practiced this lethal sequence until it was muscle memory. The tactical execution was fluid and perilous. The aircraft would approach the target from 1,500 feet. 2 miles out, the pilot would push the nose down into a screaming dive, barely clearing the ocean waves. When the distance closed to 1,500 yards, all 8 heavy machine guns in the nose would roar to life. Squeezing the trigger, the pilot would maintain a steady heading into the teeth of the enemy's mischievous fire. In a fraction of a second, the pilot would release 2 bombs to skip across the water and pull up past the masts. The entire sequence from the first round to the bombs detaching took a mere 8 seconds of focused action. In that brief window, every single machine gun in the nose of the B-25 spat out over 100 rounds. Roughly 900 armor-piercing rounds smashed directly into whatever the pilot placed in his crotcherus. Facing this god-like burst of instant firepower, the Imperial Japanese Navy's doctrines looked obsolete. Their military theory simply contained no contingency plan for this unprecedented kind of airborne onslaught. This wasn't because the Navy was incompetent, but because no such weapon had existed in naval history until then. An invisible, deadly net was already closing tightly around Admiral Kimura's critical reinforcement convoy. As early as March 2nd, American reconnaissance planes had solidly locked onto the fleet's exact location. General George Kenney's massive intelligence network had been monitoring the Japanese buildup for days. On March 2nd, American forces launched a traditional high-altitude bombing raid as a tactical opening. While the vast majority of the ordnance missed, one unlucky transport ship was heavily damaged in the raid. But that was merely a bloody appetizer. The true and historic massacre was scheduled for March 3rd. Fast forward to 9:20 on the morning of March 3rd, as the morning sun began to heat the tropical air. Aboard the Japanese destroyers A-Gum-O, a nervous officer reported multiple unidentified contacts at altitude. It was an American formation of B-17s and B-25s moving in forest entered level bombing run. Instantly, the anti-aircraft gunners across the Japanese fleet elevated their barrels to repel the bombing. However, every single Japanese sailor had just been fatally deceived by the bait hanging high in the sky. Hiding in the absolute blind spot of their elevated guns, the true reapers of death were closing in fast. 13 heavy bow fighters and 12 modified B-25s came streaming into the field from the southwest. Backwash from their massive propellers was so strong it carved long white trails of mist across the sea. Major Edward Larner personally led the charge, his gaze locked onto the ultimate prize in the distance. His piercing gaze locked onto the Admiral's flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, at a range of 1,500 yards. Larner squeezed the trigger and in a fraction of a second, the B-25's nose erupted in a roar. The crimson glow of tracers sliced through the air like the scythe of death, weaving a net across the sea. Larner fought the violent recoil, holding the control column in a death grip to maintain continuous perceived fire. The Japanese naval officers standing on the bridge of the flagship Shirayuki did not even have the time to scream or react. Japanese Ensign Takoshimi ETA, on duty on the bridge at that moment, was one of the very few men to survive that inferno. In his post-war memoirs, he described it as if the ship had been suddenly shoved into a gigantic, industrial bandsaw. The dense hail of bullets and cannon fire from the Allied planes turned the bridge into a pulverized slaughterhouse. While sailors on the exposed decks were mowed down like wheat, a terrifying thud echoed from the ship's waterline. The delayed action skip bombs sliced deep into the bowels of the destroyer like a surgeon's scalpel before exploding. The entire battlefield descended into absolute chaos as American planes attacked from every conceivable direction. Japanese captains trying to dodge an attack from the ports had perfectly exposed their broadside to the other planes. On another edge of the melee, Lieutenant John Henbiar locked his sights on the massive troop transport KYOK-US Maru. He piloted his BTWA NTYFIV over the ship, executing a devastating 8-gun strafing run from the bow to the stern. While machine gun rounds shredded the wooden decks, skip bombs bounced off the water and slammed into the ship's side. It was an execution without a trial as the enormous transport ships offered a fatal sequence of direct hits in seconds. Massive secondary explosions ripped gigantic, jagged holes in her hull as the ocean surged into the engine rooms. Groaning with the horrifying sound of twisting steel, the KYOK-US Maru began to list heavily toward the port side. The most profound tragedy befell the hundreds of infantrymen packed tightly into the lower cargo holds of the ship. When the ocean violently consumed the lower decks, these men never even had the chance to scramble up to the open sky. They were swallowed whole, drowning collectively in the dark and suffocating depths as the ship quickly disappeared. It felt like a long nightmare of blood and fire, but this one-sided massacre lasted a mere 15 minutes in reality. By 10:15 in the morning, as the last BTWA NTYFIVE disappeared, the Bismarck Sea fell eerily quiet once again. But for Admiral Kimura, those pristine tropical waters had been transformed into an apocalyptic hell's cape of fire. As the shell-shocked admiral surveyed his surroundings, the blood in his veins must have turned into freezing ice. Every single one of the 8 massive transport ships he was sworn to protect was either capsized or actively sinking. Of his 8 proud escort destroyers, half had been wiped off the map, including his flagship he had to abandon. The once clear turquoise were now choked with burning debris, fuel oil, and floating corpses of thousands. This was not just a tactical defeat, but was a devastating strategic blow to the entire Japanese Empire at the time. Of the 6,900 soldiers who boarded in Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 reached Tel Ae alive. The vast majority of survivors were fished out by submarines sneaking into the area under the cover of darkness. By the time they reached the front, they had lost all weapons and supplies, leaving them devoid of combat effectiveness. A high-ranking officer who survived the slaughter left behind a haunting summary of the battle in his final report. He wrote that the attack was unlike anything they experienced or imagined in their wildest and terrifying nightmares. When this battle report reached the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, even he could not hide his own profound shock. A mere 15-minute clash had entirely bankrupted the established rules of naval warfare in the Pacific theater. A crazy modification dreamt up in a shed had transformed the BTWE NTY-FIV into the apex predator of the ocean surface. They had not just invented a new weapon, they had violently birthed the modern concept of the aerial gunship weapon. From that day forward, every voyage would be shadowed by the dread of being sawn apart by these 8-gun chainsaws. The crushing wheel of history, lubricated by sea spray and spent brass, rolled onward into a completely new era. The invincible aura of the Japanese Navy had been buried forever beneath the waves of the blood-soaked Bismarck Sea. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield for more incredible stories of warfare.